On October 7, 1941, at 1400 hours, Wehrmacht General Heinz Guderian stood at the edge of a massive encirclement near Vyazma, watching an endless column of Soviet prisoners stumble past his command post. The column had been moving for 6 hours. Guderian's staff officers estimated 65,000 prisoners would pass through this collection point by nightfall. Intelligence reports indicated the entire Vyazma-Bryansk pocket contained 673,000 Soviet soldiers, all now cut off from retreat, surrounded, without supplies or hope of relief. Guderian had received preliminary orders from Army Group Center headquarters 3 days earlier regarding prisoner handling. The orders were brief. Prisoners were to be marched to rear area collection points. Food would be provided when available. Medical care would be limited to preventing epidemics. Security took priority over humanitarian considerations. The orders reflected a fundamental assumption that shaped German POW policy throughout the Eastern Front campaign. Soviet prisoners were not considered soldiers deserving protection under international law. They were ideological enemies, racial inferiors, and bearers of Bolshevism that threatened European civilization. Guderian understood what those orders meant in practical terms. The Wehrmacht had no prepared infrastructure for handling prisoners on this scale. Field kitchens were allocated for German troops, not prisoners. Medical facilities were overwhelmed treating combat casualties. Transportation was dedicated to moving ammunition and fuel forward, not prisoners rearward. Housing did not exist because temporary enclosures would be constructed using barbed wire and guard posts with no shelter from weather. The column passing his position included men who had fought for 3 weeks without adequate food. Many were already wounded. All were exhausted. The march to the collection point was 25 kilometers. From there, they would be moved to transit camps another 50 kilometers west. The wounded who could not march would be left behind. Those who collapsed during the march would be shot. These were not explicit orders, but practical realities that emerged from the combination of overwhelming numbers, inadequate resources, and ideological contempt. Guderian watched the prisoners and understood that most would not survive the winter. The question that should have troubled German high command was simple but remained unasked. What happens when you capture 5 million men and provide them nothing? Germany entered the Soviet Union expecting a short war. The operational plan assumed Soviet resistance would collapse within 8 to 12 weeks. Major Soviet forces would be destroyed in massive encirclement battles near the border. The Red Army would disintegrate. Stalin's government would fall. The campaign would conclude before winter. Under those assumptions, prisoner handling seemed like a temporary, administrative problem that would resolve itself when the war ended. The assumptions were wrong. Soviet resistance did not collapse. The Red Army did not disintegrate. The campaign did not conclude before winter. But German forces captured Soviet prisoners in numbers that exceeded every historical precedent. In the first 4 months of Operation Barbarossa, from June to October 1941, Wehrmacht forces captured approximately 3.2 million Soviet soldiers. That figure represented more prisoners than Germany had taken in all of World War I. It exceeded the combined prisoner populations held by all belligerents during the entire Franco-Prussian War. The scale was unprecedented, and the German military was utterly unprepared. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established international standards for prisoner of war treatment. Signatories agreed that prisoners must receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. Prisoners could be required to work, but only under reasonable conditions and with compensation. Prisoners retained rights to communicate with families and receive Red Cross parcels. Enforcement mechanisms were limited, but the standards represented an international consensus about minimum humanitarian obligations. The Soviet Union hadn't signed the Geneva Convention. Soviet authorities viewed the convention as a bourgeois construct that did not apply to revolutionary socialist states. This provided Germany with a legal justification for non-compliance with Geneva standards when dealing with Soviet prisoners. German military lawyers argued that if the Soviet Union rejected the convention, Germany had no obligation to apply convention standards to Soviet prisoners. This interpretation was legally questionable and morally catastrophic. The Geneva Convention included a reciprocity clause, but it also established minimum humanitarian standards that were supposed to apply regardless of enemy conduct. Germany's interpretation essentially meant that Soviet prisoners existed outside any legal protection whatsoever. They could be treated however German authorities deemed appropriate, with no accountability to international law. The consequences appeared immediately in the autumn of 1941. Soviet prisoners captured in the early encirclement battles were concentrated in transit camps near the front lines. These camps were temporary facilities established in open fields surrounded by barbed wire. No barracks existed. Prisoners slept in the open, regardless of weather. Latrines were crude trenches dug at the camp perimeter. Water came from wells or streams when available. Food consisted of whatever could be spared from German military supplies, which was almost nothing. The Wehrmacht logistics system was designed to supply approximately 3 million German soldiers operating across a front extending from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The system struggled to deliver adequate food, ammunition, and fuel to frontline units, even without the burden of feeding prisoners. Adding 3 million prisoners to the supply requirements was impossible. The arithmetic was brutal. A German soldier received approximately 3,000 calories daily through field kitchens. Soviet prisoners received between 200 and 400 calories daily, primarily from thin soup and occasional bread rations. That caloric intake was sufficient to sustain life for approximately 6 to 8 weeks in moderate weather. In winter conditions with no shelter, survival time dropped to 3 to 4 weeks. German authorities understood this arithmetic. Reports from transit camp commanders documented escalating mortality rates throughout October and November 1941. A typical report from a camp near Smolensk noted that of 45,000 prisoners received in early October, 12,000 had died by mid-November. The report attributed deaths to exposure, dysentery, typhus, and starvation. The camp commander requested additional food supplies and medical personnel. The request was denied. Army Group Center headquarters responded that resources were allocated to combat operations and prisoner sustenance was a lower priority. The camp near Smolensk was not exceptional. Similar mortality rates appeared in transit camps across the occupied territories. By December 1941, German records indicated that approximately 500,000 Soviet prisoners had died in captivity. That figure represented roughly 15% of all prisoners captured to that point. The death rate was accelerating as winter conditions worsened and prisoner health deteriorated from prolonged malnutrition. The ideological component of German prisoner policy became more explicit as the campaign continued. Hitler had declared before the invasion that the war against the Soviet Union was a war of annihilation. German soldiers were instructed that Bolshevism represented an existential threat to Germany and that normal rules of warfare did not apply. The Commissar Order, issued on June 6, 1941, instructed Wehrmacht units to immediately execute any captured Soviet political officers without trial. This order explicitly violated the laws of war and established that German conduct toward Soviet prisoners would be governed by ideology rather than military necessity or humanitarian obligation. The treatment of Jewish prisoners was even more severe. Soviet POWs identified as Jewish were segregated from other prisoners and either executed immediately or transferred to SS control for extermination. German authorities made no attempt to justify this policy under military rationale. It was explicitly genocidal and reflected the intersection of anti-Bolshevik ideology with racial extermination policy. The scale of Soviet POW deaths during the winter of 1941 and 1942 exceeded anything seen in modern warfare. German records indicate that approximately 2 million Soviet prisoners died between October 1941 and March 1942. That 5-month period saw mortality rates exceeding 30% monthly in many camps. Prisoners died from starvation, exposure, disease, execution, and simple neglect. The causes were interrelated. Starvation weakened immune systems, making prisoners vulnerable to typhus and dysentery. Exposure to winter weather without shelter killed men already weakened by hunger. Disease spread rapidly through overcrowded camps with no sanitation. Executions eliminated prisoners too weak to work or those identified as politically unreliable. German camp administrators documented this mortality with bureaucratic precision. Daily reports noted prisoner arrivals, deaths, and remaining population. The reports were forwarded to higher headquarters where they were compiled into statistical summaries. These summaries reveal a system that tracked mass death while doing nothing to prevent it. A representative summary from the Army Group Center area in January 1942 noted that prisoner deaths exceeded 12,000 daily across all camps in the sector. The report projected that current prisoner populations would decline by 50% within 6 weeks at current mortality rates. The projection was accurate. The treatment of Soviet prisoners stands in stark contrast to German treatment of Western Allied prisoners. British and American prisoners captured in Western Europe were generally handled according to Geneva Convention standards. They received adequate food, medical care, and shelter. They were allowed to receive Red Cross parcels and correspond with families. Mortality rates for Western Allied prisoners in German captivity were approximately 4% over the entire war. Mortality rates for Soviet prisoners exceeded 57%. This disparity was not accidental or the result of resource limitations. German forces captured approximately 230,000 British and American prisoners on the Western Front. Providing adequate care for those prisoners required resources, but the numbers were manageable within German logistics capacity. The disparity reflected a deliberate policy decision that Soviet prisoners were expendable while Western prisoners deserved protection. The decision was rooted in racial ideology that classified Slavic peoples as inferior and Bolshevism as an evil requiring extermination. The Soviet government became aware of prisoner conditions through intelligence reports and testimony from escaped prisoners who reached Soviet lines. Stalin's response was characteristically brutal and counterproductive. In August 1941, Stalin issued Order No. 270, which declared that any Soviet soldier who surrendered was a traitor to the motherland. The order stated that families of soldiers who surrendered would be subject to arrest. Soldiers who were captured and later escaped or were liberated would be investigated for treason. The order created a climate where Soviet soldiers feared capture not only because of German treatment, but because of Soviet punishment upon return. Stalin's policy had devastating consequences. Soviet soldiers fought desperately to avoid capture because surrender meant death at German hands or persecution at Soviet hands. This desperation sometimes manifested in suicidal defensive stands that inflicted heavy German casualties but also resulted in the annihilation of Soviet units that might have retreated to fight another day. The policy also meant that Soviet prisoners had no incentive to cooperate with German authorities because cooperation would be viewed as treason if they survived. The German military eventually recognized that prisoner mortality rates were creating problems beyond humanitarian concerns. Dead prisoners could not work. By 1942, German industry faced severe labor shortages as millions of German men were conscripted for military service. Soviet prisoners represented a potential labor force that was being wasted through neglect and starvation. Economic considerations gradually modified German prisoner policy, even as ideological contempt remained. In early 1942, German authorities implemented changes to prisoner handling. Food rations were increased slightly for prisoners designated as workers. Barracks were constructed at permanent camps to reduce mortality from exposure. Medical care was expanded to prevent epidemics that might spread to German personnel. These changes were motivated by economic utility rather than humanitarian concern. Prisoners who could work were valuable. Prisoners who could not work remained expendable. The improved conditions were relative. Food rations increased from starvation levels to barely adequate subsistence levels. A working prisoner might receive 1,200 calories daily instead of 400, still far below the requirement for manual labor, but sufficient to sustain life for months rather than weeks. Barracks provided shelter from weather, but were overcrowded and unheated. Medical care prevented typhus epidemics, but did not treat individual ailments beyond the minimum necessary to maintain work capacity. Soviet prisoners were employed across German industry and agriculture. They worked in coal mines, steel mills, armament factories, and construction projects. They maintained roads, cleared rubble from bombed cities, and built fortifications. The work was physically demanding and performed under guard with minimal safety precautions. Prisoners who became too weak or ill to work were returned to camps where conditions reverted to the neglect of 1941. Mortality among working prisoners was significantly lower than among non-working prisoners, but it still exceeded 20% annually. The employment of Soviet prisoners in war production violated the Geneva Convention's prohibition against forcing prisoners to work on military projects that directly supported the captors' war effort. German authorities dismissed this concern on the grounds that the convention did not apply to Soviet prisoners. The legal sophistry obscured a fundamental violation of humanitarian principles that even Germany's interpretation of international law should have recognized. Conditions in German POW camps varied significantly depending on location, administration, and economic function. Camps in Poland and occupied Soviet territories generally had worse conditions than camps in Germany proper. Transit camps near the front maintained appalling conditions throughout the war. Permanent camps in Germany that supplied labor to war industries provided better conditions because maintaining worker productivity required keeping prisoners alive and minimally healthy. Camps administered by the Wehrmacht generally treated prisoners better than camps controlled by the SS, though this was a relative distinction that meant less brutality rather than humane treatment. Some camp commanders made genuine efforts to improve prisoner conditions within the constraints of official policy and available resources. These commanders recognized that prisoners were human beings deserving basic dignity and that brutal treatment was militarily counterproductive. Such commanders were exceptions. Most camp administrators implemented official policy with bureaucratic indifference to suffering. Some exceeded official policy with cruelty that reflected personal sadism or ideological fanaticism. The treatment of Soviet prisoners became more complex as the war turned against Germany. After the defeat at Stalingrad in February 1943, German authorities recognized that Soviet victory was possible and that captured German soldiers might face retaliation for German treatment of Soviet prisoners. This created incentives to improve Soviet prisoner conditions as a form of insurance against future Soviet conduct toward German prisoners. The improvements were modest and inconsistent, but represented a shift from the absolute contempt of 1941. German propaganda attempted to recruit Soviet prisoners for military service against the Soviet Union. The Russian Liberation Army, commanded by captured Soviet General Andrei Vlasov, was established in 1944 with German support. Vlasov had been captured in 1942 and had become convinced that Stalin's regime was more dangerous to Russia than German occupation. He believed that Russia could be liberated from Bolshevism with German assistance. This belief was naive given German occupation policies, but it appealed to some Soviet prisoners who saw collaboration as the only alternative to death in German captivity. The German recruitment effort had limited success. Approximately 1 million Soviet citizens served in German military formations during the war, but most were not POWs. Many were volunteers from occupied territories who joined German auxiliary units to escape starvation or forced labor. Others were coerced into service through threats or promises of better treatment. Genuine ideological converts to the German cause were relatively rare among Soviet prisoners because German treatment made it clear that collaboration would not lead to liberation, but merely to a different form of exploitation. The question of collaboration haunted Soviet prisoners who survived German captivity. Stalin's government viewed all prisoners with suspicion. Returning prisoners were interrogated extensively to determine whether they had cooperated with German authorities. Those found to have collaborated, even under duress, faced execution or imprisonment in the Gulag. Those cleared of collaboration charges still faced discrimination and surveillance. Many returning prisoners were denied Communist Party membership, excluded from professional positions, and subjected to ongoing investigation throughout their lives. The treatment of returning prisoners reflected Stalin's pathological suspicion and the Soviet regime's inability to acknowledge that capture did not automatically constitute treason. Soviet authorities never publicly recognized the suffering of Soviet POWs in German captivity because acknowledging that suffering would require explaining why the Soviet government had done nothing to protect prisoners and had actively persecuted them upon return. The silence continued for decades after the war. German records document that 5.7 million Soviet soldiers were captured during the war. Of these, approximately 3.3 million died in captivity. The mortality rate was 57.5%. This figure makes Soviet prisoners in German captivity one of the largest single victim groups of World War II, exceeded only by Jewish victims of the Holocaust and Soviet civilian deaths from German occupation policies. The comparison with other prisoner populations emphasizes the exceptional brutality of German treatment toward Soviet prisoners. Of approximately 230,000 British and American prisoners held by Germany, approximately 9,000 died, yielding a mortality rate of 4%. Of approximately 235,000 German prisoners held by Britain and America, fewer than 1% died. The contrast demonstrates that prisoner mortality was not an inevitable consequence of wartime conditions, but resulted from deliberate policy decisions about which prisoners deserved protection. Soviet treatment of German prisoners provides a complicated counterpoint. The Soviet Union captured approximately 3.1 million German soldiers during the war. Of these, approximately 400,000 died in captivity, yielding a mortality rate of approximately 15%. This rate was significantly higher than Western Allied treatment of German prisoners, but far lower than German treatment of Soviet prisoners. Soviet prisoner camps were brutal, underfed, and often lethal, particularly in the immediate aftermath of major battles when Soviet logistics struggled to handle sudden influxes of prisoners. However, Soviet policy did not implement systematic starvation or ideologically driven extermination comparable to German policy toward Soviet prisoners. The distinction matters for understanding the nature of the conflict. German treatment of Soviet prisoners was not simply harsh military necessity or reciprocal brutality, but reflected ideological assumptions about racial hierarchies and political systems. Nazi ideology classified Slavic peoples as subhuman and Bolshevism as a Jewish conspiracy requiring elimination. These ideological premises shaped prisoner policy more than military considerations or resource constraints. The result was mass death on a scale that shocked even German officers who had witnessed the brutality of the Eastern Front. Some German commanders protested prisoner treatment on military rather than humanitarian grounds. They argued that brutal treatment of prisoners encouraged desperate Soviet resistance that increased German casualties. They noted that reports of prisoner treatment filtered back to Soviet lines and stiffened enemy resolve. They pointed out that excessive prisoner mortality wasted a potential labor force that could support the German war economy. These protests occasionally resulted in local improvements but never changed fundamental policy because the policy reflected decisions made at the highest levels of German government based on ideological rather than military reasoning. The historical legacy of Soviet prisoner treatment remains contested. German historians generally acknowledge the appalling conditions and massive mortality, but sometimes contextualize these facts within arguments about resource scarcity or Soviet non-compliance with the Geneva Convention. Russian historians emphasize German brutality and ideological motivation while often omitting discussion of Stalin's Order No. 270 and the persecution of returning prisoners. Western historians attempt to document the reality while avoiding false equivalencies that minimize German responsibility or ignore Soviet contributions to prisoner suffering. The essential facts are clear and documented through German military records, Soviet testimony, and post-war investigations. Germany captured 5.7 million Soviet soldiers during World War II. German authorities provided these prisoners with grossly inadequate food, shelter, and medical care. German policy was driven by ideological contempt and implemented with bureaucratic efficiency. The result was the death of 3.3 million prisoners from starvation, disease, exposure, execution, and neglect. This represents one of history's largest mass atrocities and reflects a deliberate policy decision rather than unfortunate circumstances. The treatment of Soviet prisoners matters for understanding the nature of the Nazi regime and the character of World War II on the Eastern Front. The conflict was not simply a military struggle between competing powers, but an ideological war in which one side explicitly rejected humanitarian constraints. German conduct toward Soviet prisoners demonstrated that Nazi racial ideology was not merely propaganda, but policy that shaped military operations and resulted in mass death. The prisoner mortality figures document what happens when ideology eliminates humanitarian obligations and bureaucratic systems implement indifference to suffering. The individual stories behind the statistics convey the human reality. A Soviet soldier captured near Minsk in July 1941 who marched 200 kilometers to a transit camp, received no food for 5 days, watched comrades die from exhaustion and exposure, survived the march only to die from typhus in an overcrowded camp 3 weeks later. A Ukrainian prisoner who survived the winter of 1941 through determination and luck was selected for labor service in a German factory, worked 12-hour shifts for 3 years, survived Allied bombing of the factory, and was liberated in 1945 only to be arrested by Soviet authorities, interrogated for collaboration, and sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag. A Russian officer who refused to cooperate with German attempts at political conversion endured solitary confinement and reduced rations, maintained his dignity through years of captivity, returned to the Soviet Union in 1945, and was executed as a traitor despite his resistance to German recruitment. These stories multiplied by millions constitute the reality behind the mortality statistics. Each death represented an individual with family, hopes, fears, and a life destroyed by policies that treated human beings as ideological abstractions rather than people deserving protection under international law and basic human decency. The question that opened this account asked what happens when you capture 5 million men and provide them nothing. History answered that question with precision. 3,300,000 die. The deaths occur through starvation, disease, exposure, and violence. The timeline extends over 4 years, but accelerates in the first winter when conditions are worst and prisoners are weakest. The responsibility belongs to the regime that captured prisoners and implemented policies guaranteeing their death. The lesson extends beyond World War II to any conflict where ideology eliminates humanitarian constraints and bureaucratic systems, implement mass violence with administrative efficiency. The treatment of Soviet prisoners by Germany during World War II represents one of history's clearest examples of how ideological contempt translates into mass atrocity. The numbers are documented, the policies are recorded, the consequences are undeniable. Germany captured 5.7 million Soviet soldiers. Germany provided grossly inadequate care. 3.3 million died. The simplicity of that sequence obscures the complexity of individual suffering but captures the essential truth. Ideology killed millions through the mechanism of deliberate neglect implemented with bureaucratic thoroughness by a military and political system that had eliminated humanitarian obligation as a constraint on policy.